Hello. Welcome to this conversation on anti-Asian violence at the intersection of gender and white supremacy. This event is brought to you by the Michelle R. Clayman Institute for Gender Research and is co-sponsored by the Center for the Comparative Study in Race and Ethnicity here at Stanford. My name is Adrian Daub and I'm the director of the Clayman Institute. It was important to us to convene an event like this in the wake of the horrific attacks in Atlanta 2 weeks ago and in the wake of a more general surge in anti-Asian violence in the US. For many researchers at Stanford who work on the history of gender and race, as well as for those who experience racism and sexism as a daily occurrence, the violence and its targets were shocking, but perhaps not surprising. What horrified us was the way the framing in law enforcement and in media, from the now infamous invocation of the killer's quote unquote bad day by the police via the bizarrely dehumanizing invocation of the shooter's sex addiction to the suggestion that more policing might hold the solution to this tide of violence, seemed deliberately deaf to what our Stanford colleague Gordon Chang last week called the quote long sickening history of this type of violence. And of course, this kind of forgetfulness itself has a history. The claim that anti-Asian violence isn't somehow about race, doesn't have anything to do with white supremacy, is somehow more about the killer or about religion or about sex or about anything other than race, has itself a history. An attack on an Asian massage parlor is almost by necessity both about race and gender. The question of what kind of work is considered sex work and how we treat those who perform that work is about race and about gender. Independent of what went on in these spas, what the police, what the media imagined went on there, what the killer imagined went on there, what media ask all of us to imagine went on there, all of this seems to have a bearing on the killings and the broader climate of violence in which they transpired. The question of how American society expects its police forces to interact with these extremely vulnerable populations has, as one of our guests, Elena Shih, pointed out in the New York Times just a few days ago, has a long and deeply racialized history. The way white evangelical culture has recently used categories like sex addiction and the catch-all of human trafficking to connect sex panics with anxieties around immigration is deeply entwined with white supremacy, as Melissa Brown will show. And invoking the state as a protector for the women like the ones who were murdered in Atlanta is not necessarily akin to working towards less violence and increased safety, but rather has a long history in US immigration enforcement of producing its exact opposite, as Ann Wang will argue. We're deeply honored and grateful to be joined today by these three brilliant scholars, whose work I certainly have turned to in the last few days to make sense of recent events and their broader implications. I will turn it over to them in a minute. One quick note on process, as you've already seen on the slide, this is a Zoom webinar, meaning you will need to submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We do usually encourage our attendees to post questions as they occur to you. The speakers will see them. They may not react to them right away, but they can build them into their conversation as it evolves. With that said, a big thank you to our amazing speakers today for agreeing to appear at such short notice. We've had an incredible response to this event, which is certainly due to these brilliant scholars and their timely perspectives. This event is part of our Clayman Conversation series, which convenes feminist leaders and gender scholars to discuss events through an intersectional lens. And we do hope that you will join us for future events. Thank you all for being here as our audience. I will now briefly introduce our three panelists. Ann Wang is Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies and Social Welfare at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. She is formerly a UC President's postdoctoral fellow at UC Berkeley School of Law, and previously held appointments at the University of Washington and visiting positions at the University of Hawaii. Her current ethnographic work traces the law's writing of immigration law and enforcement at the site of gender and sexual violence, focusing on the work of service providers and legal advocates with Asian immigrant women and their communities. She examines how the law writes and maintains the meaning of protection under the Violence Against Women Act's immigration provisions, the enlistment of the non-citizen legal subject towards policing, accumulative cooperation, and the visa petition's role in neoliberal punishment practices. Elena Shih is the Manning Assistant Professor of American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University, where she directs a human trafficking research cluster through Brown's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. She's book project, Manufacturing Freedom, Trafficking, Rescue, Rehabilitation, and the Slave-Free Good, is under contract with University of California Press. It's a global ethnography of the transnational social movement to combat human trafficking in China, Thailand, and the United States. She is an outreach organizer with Red Canary Song, a grassroots coalition of massage workers, sex workers, and allies in New York City. They will be in conversation with Melissa Brown, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow at our institute. She graduated from the University of Maryland with a PhD in sociology in 2019. Brown's current project centers on how Black women exotic dancers based in the urban South use social networking smartphone application for advertising and networking. Her areas of expertise include intersectionality, digital sociology, social movement, and sexual politics. Thank you all three for being here today, and I will now turn it over to Melissa. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Adrian. So, as Adrian mentioned, I'm a sociologist by training, and in my work, I use intersectionality and Black feminist thought to center how Black women innovate digital practices while navigating the ways digital society replicates longstanding intersectional inequalities. So for these areas of research, I focus on three broad topics. First, I focus on Black women's social media activism against police brutality and sexual violence. I also study how digital culture is created and innovated by Black women and Black LGBTQ people. And finally, I look at how Black women sex workers act as entrepreneurs in today's platform economy. So another part of my history is that I was raised in Metro Atlanta, and from about 5 to 17, I attended Southern Baptist and Missionary Baptist churches. So as I moderate this conversation, I'm going to draw on my personal experience as well as my sociological knowledge about Georgia to talk about it both as a former colony as well as a state, and to reflect on how I'm sorry, let me see. Am I heard clearly? I'm getting a response that I'm not heard. So hopefully you can hear me clearly now. And I'm going to be reflecting on how the institutional forces are at play in the anti-Asian violence perpetuated by a white evangelical man as we witness as news and media consumers. So my research follows the embodied practices and experiences of Black women to bring to light how the social and legal construction of Black womanhood justifies their systemic devaluation of Black people's labor. So for example, in my research, I mapped the strip clubs that Black women performed at in the DC, Memphis, and Atlanta metropolitan areas. And one of the things that I found was there was a bifurcated racial segregation in each city such that Black women exotic dancers rarely performed in the same racial or economic areas as white women exotic dancers. So in the case of Atlanta, which is also the former capital of the Confederacy, nearly all the strip clubs were located beyond the boundaries of North Druid Hills, which historically was a community formed as a whites-only neighborhood over a century ago through racial zoning practices that were currently legal at the time. So conversely, the majority of the strip clubs that Black women performed at in Atlanta were located in regions of the city that historically were formed by freedmen in the years after the Civil War as shanty towns, and then were converted into housing projects by federal and state governments. Furthermore, Georgia is a site wherein the trafficking of humans was once a legal enterprise that drew on the sexual exploitation of enslaved Black women as a form of reproductive technology through enslavement of their children from birth. Further, the institution of the Southern Baptist Church, formed to uphold the enslavement of Black people, occurred during the Civil War. However, I'd argue that there's a curious paradox in that the contemporary Georgia, the evangelical church, particularly the white majority Missionary Baptist Church, are key institutional figures in the conservative movement against sex work and trafficking. The use of the missionary framework shapes the discourse and relationship among trafficking, gender, and citizenship at the local, state, and national level. And they use this discourse in tandem with interrelated institutions of the state and the nation to propel white supremacy and patriarchy in the 21st century. The origins of this contemporary discourse is informed by Georgia's history and role in the trafficking of Africans and the exploitation of Black bodies and labor as a settler colony within a plantation economy. So, in light of today's conversation, when I reflect on anti-Asian violence, I hope through this conversation we can bring attention to, one, how white supremacy draws on the afterlife of slavery to orient the relationship Asians have with the state and the nation, particularly as it pertains to their labor. Two, how the white supremacist gaze imposed on the Asian person in America and Asian nations through policing, trafficking, and immigration policies function to uphold U.S. imperialism. Three, how the intersectionality of gender, race, citizenship, and other identities nuances the ways members of various marginalized groups experience state-sanctioned violence as well as purported solutions to violence. And finally, the imperative to envision alternative frames around labor, migration, and sexuality to empower women of color while also dismantling the white supremacist and capitalist institutions that make their exploitation possible. And with that, I will be turning it over to Elena.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that important introduction. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I'm going to take my 5 minutes to do a very, very deep dive into something very, very boring, that of municipal licenses. But I hope at the end of my talk, you'll get a sense of why this is vitally important in our discussion. Just 2 weeks after the New England Patriots finished their Super Bowl run to victory in February 2019, a scandal erupted that placed their team's general manager, Robert Kraft, in the middle of a sex trafficking sting on Orchids of Asia Day Spa, an Asian massage business in Palm Beach, Florida. National news media, as you probably remember, reveled in narratives designed to agitate fears of sex trafficking. However, the initial sneak and peek warrant that broke the case was issued after a public health inspector arrived at Orchids to conduct a routine health investigation. The initial arrests were prompted by a citation unrelated to prostitution or trafficking at all. In the public records around the case, Inspector Herzog's report noted that she had received training on how to identify victims of human trafficking, which included the presence of suitcases, clothing, a refrigerator full of food, and condoms as evidence. At Orchid, she recorded that signs of trafficking on the premise included a young Asian woman who was, quote unquote, dressed provocatively, spoke little English, appeared nervous, and avoided eye contact with her. By April 2019, prosecutors conceded that there was not a single case of human trafficking amongst all the workers who had been arrested and interviewed that day. And while Kraft's misdemeanor prostitution solicitation charges were summarily dropped last September, several of the low-wage migrant Chinese sex workers arrested in the raids were turned over to ICE custody because they were undocumented. One worker was held for months in ICE custody awaiting deportation proceedings while being transferred to multiple immigration and detention facilities. During this time, the state seized nearly $3,000 from her personal bank account under civil forfeiture proceedings, while another worker was held for 5 months before being released. Other workers with green cards or citizenship status were jailed, fined, and released, only to find their old workplaces shut down, forcing them into the precarious position of looking for new options for work. Massage work being one of an already limited number of options for migrant low-wage workers in the service and manufacturing sectors. This really troubling bait and switch in which human trafficking rescue often ends in criminalization and deportation reveals paradoxes that organizers, scholars, and policymakers have grappled with for years and offers us one insight into the intersections of policing, the anti-trafficking industrial complex, and civilian vigilante violence that is unleashed on Asian massage workers in the United States. In the days after the brutal murder of 8 people connected to Asian massage businesses in Atlanta on March 16th, media seemed to center on 2 primary questions. One, whether or not these were sex workers, and the adjacent question of whether or not they were victims of human trafficking. The second question seemed to home in on how horrible the working conditions are for these women in this kind of work. Both of these questions seem to detach the violence experienced on March 16th from larger systems of precarity that low-wage migrant workers face and systems of violence that Asian massage workers face because their industry has been so closely associated with sex trafficking. In the past 5 years, anti-trafficking NGOs have introduced a brand new category of what they called illicit massage business. And here I'm quoting Polaris Project, one of the country's largest anti-trafficking organizations, which targets police towards Asian massage businesses that they consider to be hubs of human trafficking. Nearly all of these interventions have called for the heightened surveillance and policing of such businesses, which has resulted in hundreds of raids across the country. And in order to crack down on Asian massage work, they aren't resorting to regular policing. Rather, dozens of states around the country have introduced municipal licensing ordinances that justify the policing of Asian massage work by purely allowing a police officer to arrest a worker if they cannot show evidence of a license. As an outreach organizer for Red Canary Song, massage workers have reported to me weekly intrusions of their workplaces by police asking them to show licenses. Legal aid lawyers working in New York who are assigned to represent Asian massage workers have noted the majority of prostitution-related offense for Asian women in New York apply a violation of New York education law 6512, which is a licensing law, specifically prohibiting people from unlicensed massage. These new licensing barriers are discriminatory on the basis of their English language requirements and their anti-immigrant undertones, and they really subject workers to significant new financial pressures and administrative barriers to work. Mimi, a worker in her 50s, shared that she recently spent $7,000 on a fake licensing program that promised her a license in Massachusetts. Others report that they frequently pay up to $1,000 to complete a program that earns them an aromatherapy certificate in New York, only to learn that this supposed certification would not exempt them from arrest in the United States. So I want to stop there and turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Ann Wang, who can give us a little bit more of like a historical arc on this, and really looking forward to talking more about how something as mundane as licensing really allows us to see the different kinds of racialized and gendered policing that is enacted, not only on Asian massage workers, but across the low-wage migrant workforce. Welcome, Leanne.
Thank you so much, Elena. I'm really honored to be able to present alongside Elena, and I just wanted to thank Shivani Mehta, Natalie Mason, and Adrian Dodd for this opportunity to speak both with Elena and Melissa Brown. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and my look at the immigration visa provisions within the Violence Against Women's Act. And I think generally in our sort of popular imagination, the Violence Against Women's Act is remembered and celebrated as a feminist success. But I also think it's really important for us to remember that VAWA passes as a provision within the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which was up until that date, the largest omnibus crime bill that we had seen here within the nation state. This is within the 1990s era where we also see hate crimes legislation. We also see a rollback on federal spending for welfare provisions, from basic needs to cash assistance to educational programs. We see a drastic increase in federal funding for arms and towards the military industrial complex. And this is also where we see the prison boom for the first supermax prisons. And I'm drawing largely from Ruthie Gilmore's work here, Maram Kaba and other folks that have written on the prison industrial complex and its relationships to gender and sexual violence. And so within this moment, we see increased funding for VAWA, but the majority of funds that go towards VAWA actually go to law enforcement agencies. A very, very, very small fraction goes to women's shelters. We also see within VAWA lots of issues around tribal jurisdiction. And I think there's been a lot of work in Indigenous feminist thought and writing that have looked at the relationship between protection and the nation state and its reinforcement of settler colonial projects that have within it heteropatriarchal logics. So in the 2000s, we see VAWA reauthorized and increased to include new immigration provisions. many of which were designed specifically for undocumented survivors of gender and sexual violence, primarily the U and the T visas. And these were significant at that time because they were the only provisions that were designed specifically for survivors who are undocumented without legal status. But these are also the only provisions within VAWA that also require someone to cooperate and become certified to cooperate with law enforcement in order to be eligible to apply for this form of protection. And I don't mean to in order to be guaranteed to receive the protection, but just to be eligible to apply. And so the question then becomes, what does this mean when state-sponsored protection reveals itself and is made available to immigrant women of color through this logic of policing and punishment? This is particularly important in looking at the work of Beth Ritchie and the work of Insight, where folks have documented that VAWA and policing as a primary solution to violence against women has actually resulted in increased violence in the lives of communities of color. We actually haven't seen a reduction in gender and sexual violence since this moment, but we most certainly have seen an increase in policing and prison expansion within the nation state and globally. And so I wanted to raise this question of what it would mean to actually think about not only white privilege through the stories that we have heard around anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism, and particularly within the Atlanta shootings, but to actually think instead about the white supremacy of the state, and in particular forms of state violence such as immigration law. If we were to think actually about the relationship between protection and punishment, what are the terms upon which protection are offered to undocumented immigrant women, and how is that protection actually advancing policing? These are the types of questions that I think are really central to this current moment in thinking about anti-Asian violence and its relationship to the longevity and the sustainability, or actually I should actually say the reproduction of anti-Blackness and US colonialism. To think beyond the individual prejudice of misogyny and instead towards thinking about the heteropatriarchy of systemic and structural violence. So if we actually thought about what feminist critiques of mandatory reporting laws have laid forward for us, that mandatory reporting laws actually reduce conversations about rape. If we were to think about that and extend that to the way we think about anti-Asian violence, what can that possibly open for us? Secondly, if we were to think about the work of scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality, not about intersecting identities, but rather about the logics of intersecting structures and the limits of anti-discrimination law that actually privilege a single access framework around a white normative subject. So the sort of reduction of the strength of anti-discrimination law, which results in a normative subject that actually locks out women of color. How might we apply those critiques towards thinking about anti-Asian violence and the limits of hate crimes legislation? And so in sort of moving towards this analysis, the undocumented crime victim, which sort of raises, I think, the tenets of existing immigration law and its ability to sort of protect, we can think about this currently today when we think about sanctuary laws as well. So the LAPD was one of the first police agencies to come out in support of sanctuary, actually. But what the LAPD used was the figure of undocumented women who were survivors of gender and sexual violence to say that these were groups of women who were protected, but not other communities of color. And what does that mean when we know that many mixed status families live together? What does that mean when we know that policing against immigrant communities also polices other communities of color? And so how I think sort of this critique towards policing and the reliance on criminalization is also really important when we're thinking about anti-Asian violence, yet the criminalization of sex work is still in place. And I think I'm actually going to end there and to turn it back over to the Institute. Thank you so much.
Thank you both to you, Elena and Leanne, for your introductions and discussing briefly your research. We actually have one question so far that I actually think can help frame the conversation in the way that we're thinking about it. So I think I'll ask you both to kind of name what it is you mean in your own research when you talk about Asian massage workers, more so Elena, and then sex workers more broadly. Is this a general term that you're using? How do you see the difference between being a masseuse and selling sex in the context of what we're discussing today?
Thanks so much, Melanie, for the question. I think that I want to be very, very clear here that regardless of whether or not the particular workers that work in Asian massage businesses do or do not engage in commercial sex, the entire industry is policed because it is regarded, because of its proximity to sex trafficking. So the point of this is that we don't even need to get to the bottom of whether or not workers are having sex or are not having sex to know that way too much policing is happening here. So that's one part of the question. The second is that the majority of workers that I speak with in Providence and in Flushing do not claim the term sex worker, whether or not they are doing sex work. They refer to all of their work strictly as massage work. And that is something that we respect when speaking with them and when organizing alongside of them, that even though the amplification and advocacy of these concerns around how decriminalization of sex work inherently decreases policing doesn't necessarily mean that we are calling these people or labeling these workers sex workers. So I would say that not all people, even if they are doing different kinds of sex work, consider themselves or use that language of sex work. And that's also further complicated by, legal definitions and colloquial definitions in Chinese and Korean, the two primary languages of workers that I speak with. And then the last thing I would say about the questionability of definitions is that there is always a continuum of what Rochelle Brenes and Eileen Boris have referred to as intimate labor, a enormous continuum of which sex work is certainly one kind of work. I always gesture to the really incredible work of Thai sex worker organizers at the Empower Foundation, who created an advocacy game that they called 7 hours and 55 minutes. This is a game that was aimed to demonstrate how in the lives of them, in the daily life of them as sex workers, if you wanted to look at it within the context of an industrialized, 8-hour, 9-to-5 working day, maybe 5 minutes may be spent having penetrative sexual intercourse, and the majority of the rest of the time is spent doing all sorts of emotional labor to make their jobs as intimate workers, as sex workers, successful. So where I think I encourage the audience to think through what actually makes something sex work. At what point is it sex work to legally? At what point morally do you find discomfort with that term? I think people who are engaged broadly in these different kinds of intimate labor don't often fixate on a particular categorization because they are seeing massage work as one kind of labor that exists on a continuum that may or may not include other intimate erotic acts. So it is all completely complicated and even more complicated by law on the one hand and linguistic definitions on another.
Thank you for providing that clarity. I really appreciate how you noted that it's very complicated. And I think that what you're both speaking to is part of the complication is about the definitions that we, or not even we, but our society imposes on labor. And then with those definitions, the way then the state imposes policing on these types of labor. So it's actually a very slippery slope because at one time and period, things that are considered sex work or legal can, with some type of pushback from some of the organizations that you name, be entirely reclassified. So even in the history of the United States, brothels were entirely legal for a time period, and then came the progressive era and that ended. So people were literally leaving in their houses legally, and then one day they weren't, and it led to all types of ramifications that I think Leanne points out about once we impose this type of policing under protection, there are actually a lot of negative outcomes that come from the way that the state decides to label this type of labor. think I want to see if this current question. So I think in the context of what our conversation is today is about this way that what we witnessed, particularly as news and media consumers, since we are not in Atlanta right now, was, I think, the most visible act of anti-Asian violence that we've seen in a long time. And quite readily, people took up this banner of Stop Asian Hate to speak to what was going on. So I think in the context of your research, how does anti-Asian violence come up when you talk about both the state and as well as the ways that women in particular are affected by how the state responds to anti-Asian violence and the ways that communities also respond to anti-Asian violence?
Melissa, did you want us to answer in a particular order, or?
I think Leanne actually would make sense for you to go first, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think what's in the way the state responds in particular to anti-Asian violence, I think one of the limits is thinking about anti-Asian violence within personal prejudice and individual acts of prejudice and implicit bias. And I think that there are many scholars that have already documented this work. If we think about Dean Spade and Craig Wolsey's work, where they looked at hate crimes legislation and the limits for hate crimes legislation in addressing violence against queer communities of color. Tamara Noper just recently did a fantastic webinar for the Asian American Writers Workshop on the role of anti-Blackness within hate crimes legislation and its rollout. And so I actually wanted to sort of pull in there, how can we actually think about some of the critiques that intersectionality frameworks can bring us in thinking about anti-Asian violence. And I don't mean simply by saying, let's think about sort of representations or provisions of solidarity that try to make comparative or racial comparative analyses. I'm actually thinking instead about where we actually see state structures of violence intersecting. And for me, one of those intersections is through immigration law. So instead of looking at the failures of immigration law, I'm actually interested in when it's had its successes and at what cost has immigration law provided protection as a form of success. To me, the figure of the survivor of violence as a feminized figure, as a productive figure, as a figure of development and a figure of capitalist logic is at sort of the crux of a lot of this. And Elena pointed to much of that, and Melissa, so did you also in your introduction, about the role of racial capitalism and the role of the figure of the feminine. And when the state polices that figure of the feminine as a successful figure, as a deviant figure, as a worthy figure, but also how that protection always relies within it a logic of policing for the state to come in and enforce. And much of, I think, the examples that both of you shared kind of shows what happens when people's lives fall outside of that example. And secondly, what happens when the lives of Asian immigrant women are made to match up to that figure if that figure is a figure of policing. So within the VAWA provisions, the undocumented crime victim is a legal figure of anti-Blackness. It's used to actually put the future of applicants within a line of always participating in policing and its logics against communities of color. And so that's sort of, I think, what we have to actually push back upon is to say, why is it that we normalize and expect that it's okay to ask Asian American communities in this moment where communities are already experiencing violence to then say, let's all learn how to call the police? Why do we normalize that? Why do we expect that immigrants or Asian American communities should be the ones to always call the police? And so I just want to lift up and raise the work of creative interventions, Mimi Kim's work, in documenting all the different ways that communities have found forms of safety and accountability for each other without relying on police. The things that you do, your community, your family, your friends, your neighborhood, the things you already do. And so I think that's really important. So I'll just end there.
Thank you so much for bringing in the work of transformative community-based approaches that resist policing. I think they are so necessary because of how policing itself has become so integrated into the fabric of community watch to begin with. And so one of the reasons, like one of the ways these weird license regimes emerge is because it became slightly unpopular to police and arrest Asian women who were deemed to be victims of sex trafficking, for these ideas that Leanne described of Asian women being particularly seen as like perfect and ideal victims. In some ways, they weren't as easy to arrest violently as perhaps Black and Latinx counterparts. And so a lot of the work in the past decade, I think, has focused on softening the tentacles of policing and making it appear quite benevolent. And it's been incredibly powerful. One of the things that I did as part of ethnographic work as a graduate student in Los Angeles was I participated on these weekly outreach opportunities with students at a local university, mostly white, male, evangelical Christian students who really felt it was their calling to use their particular privilege of access. So the fact that they, as cis white men, could go into an Asian massage business, ostensibly try to purchase sex, and that they would actually be taken to the back. Once they were taken to the back, they, of course, there's this like surprise aha moment. Hey, guess what? You don't have to have sex with me. I just want to interview you for my school paper. Can I rescue you? And the way that these operations were set up is that, you know, people on the outside, so that included myself, we would participate in like a stakeout, and we're instructed to write notes detailing exactly who's going in, who's coming out. And oftentimes what was most troubling about all of this heavy civilian and racialized vigilance and surveillance was that at the end of these sessions, these notes were given to the LAPD. So it is all these forms of civilian, absolutely racist vigilance that have certainly bolstered state power, because it is like this kind of data that is being given back to law enforcement, but it's also law enforcement or these desires of civilian policing have justified this kind of civilian response. And that's why I completely agree that Mimi Kim's work is so important, to think of community-based alternatives to these kinds of everyday policing.
Thank you both for that. So when you were talking, what struck me about the last thing you said about the white racialized vigilance, and thinking about the young man being a white male evangelical, it struck me that when he labeled his actions as eliminating temptation, I thought there is the savior rhetoric exposes the colonizer logic. And so hearing then that this mundane practice of what's supposed to be a mundane practice of doing ethnography as a grad student is actually a funnel for the police state makes me think about, well, when we think of the history of the United States, like we began policing with the citizens, right? So white men settlers being deputized to monitor enslaved Africans attempting to escape, and then how that has become the artifice of the entire state apparatus for policing the United States. And now hearing this idea of this ideal Asian woman victim being used to justify more policing, and just the ways it gets modernized, the ways that different bodies, identities are implicated is really intriguing. I really appreciate you both bringing that to the forefront. So we have tons of questions, and so I'm trying to see if I can combine some into I guess one key takeaway. So some of what I'm hearing is, or seeing rather, is about this idea of when we look at policing and white supremacy in relation to ethnic identities, what are the ways that we can talk about how we can advocate for remedying the ways that policing exploits, I guess, ethnic bias, as opposed to I guess as opposed to what we've highlighted is this way that they claim to protect, but they actually exacerbate. So I'm hearing you both say that abolition is potentially the answer. And I wonder if you can speak more to that.
Yeah, I see also in the chat some contours around touching upon decrim. So I'll speak specifically to abolition and its intersections with the call to decriminalize all forms of sex work. So I think what's really, really interesting about the move to decriminalize as opposed to legalize prostitution, so this is a really, really important distinction, is that it's the removal of all different possibilities of criminalizing people. And so this would include not only the removal of, prostitution solicitation charges, but also of all of these periphery auxiliary charges that have been used to police people. And I think that we, in terms of alliances also, that it is not, this moment is not purely just about Asian massage work. It is perceived to be about sex trafficking, but it's also just about the policing of these communities, in particular, not only like a vocational licensing ordinance, but building code and eviction notices are also commonly used to displace Asian migrant massage businesses. And this is, of course, under the interests of gentrification. The Flushing Anti-Displacement Alliance, FADA, has been pushing back against the plan to build luxury condos on, near the intersection of 39th Street and Main Street, where a lot of these massage businesses are. And so it is absolutely these like business interests that have been driving all of these forms of policing. So I think in addition to an abolitionist framework around decriminalizing different forms of sex work, just decriminalizing working class people in general, and finding ways that people can live in the community, their communities that they built.
I'm trying to, there was a question in the chat about, what can be done around VAWA. And I think there are many things we can sort of think about the way from its primary contributions towards law enforcement agencies. That's like an initial push. But we can also think about the immigration provisions, like the temporary visas that I had mentioned, as being one of the only provisions within VAWA that actually require certification of cooperation with law enforcement in order to be eligible to apply. What would it mean if we actually removed that requirement? And also did the political work to think about why that requirement is tied to folks without legal status. How does it require one to speak? How does it require the sort of ideas around a perfect form of innocence? And it's tied to vulnerability. So I'm hearing a lot of language right now within, our political discourses around the call for more vulnerability. And I'm not sure what that is about when I don't actually feel that we are yet at a place where we're actually thinking critically about what makes communities vulnerable. And I think that call is also tied to this sort of like collective identification with victims. And what does that mean when Asian American communities are identifying with victims, but are still advancing and advocating for the criminalization of sex work? And so I think these are things that we have to think very, very carefully about. And for me, abolition is also imagining a world without punishment, and imagining and using abolitionist feminist language to think about what we have actually yet to imagine. It's very difficult work. It's not something to me that I feel like has like a ready policy solution, because I think what it actually requires first is for us to be able to think about policy solutions as themselves reifying and reproducing racial and sexual violence. And that's a really difficult switch to do. And so I think those are some of the frames I think it's important to kind of put forward.
I just want to talk basically, building off of Leanne, one of the VAWA provisions that Leanne has written about is, of course, the T visa, the trafficking visa, which is introduced after 2000 following the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And what it does is creates the formal legal category of victim. It is offers 3 years temporary legal residency to people who can prove that they were victims of trafficking and who agree to participate in the prosecution of their traffickers. So even ideal victimhood is also tied into the same tentacles of prosecution and policing that are aimed to, to build innocence and deservingness of being a US citizen. And so many people, even if they are absolutely subject to not necessarily being victims of sex trafficking, but being victims of labor trafficking because of the really gross kinds of labor violations that happen across the low-wage migrant workforce. Even those people often reject this highly, coveted opportunity to apply for a T visa because they cannot participate in the really, really onerous and arduous entanglements with the state and with prosecution and with the legal system that such an amnesty visa offers.
Absolutely. Thank you for those responses. I think what you both brought attention to for me was this idea of the ways that the solutions that were designed 21st century, right? There's so much that happened in the 21st century related to these overlapping identities of labor, immigrant, and women, and the ways that these different policies are almost in tension with each other, particularly based on who is the being or the body on which that policy is constructed. And in the case of Asian women, it seems like with this idea of victimization, there's also a perception of who Asian women are based on racial stereotypes here in the United States. And so one question that was brought up that I think speaks to the ways that the trafficking narrative to me almost engages this fetishization is when we talk about the fetishization of Asian women, there are so many cultural and mediums and modes at play into what that has created, particularly when we think of, say, pornography. So would either of you be able to bring attention to the ways that you believe that this fetishization of Asian women and women of color more broadly kind of contributes to the ways that these policies are implemented and how they shape and affect Asian women workers?
Yeah, I'll definitely speak. I'll step one step back from pornography and talk maybe about sex tourism, for instance, in Thailand, where I've done a lot of work. So there's a number of anti-trafficking rescue organizations and anti-porn groups that have descended in Thailand in recent years to try and stop trafficking in red light districts, which they consider to be, all forms of sex work akin to sex trafficking. And so they often arrive, religious groups through missionary trips, and then secular groups through study tours and human trafficking reality tours that I've written about with Elizabeth Bernstein. All of these take the very, very visible commercial sex tourist industry in Thailand as, justification and free rein for them to initiate their own kinds of policing and interventions. And I think it does often porn and sex tourism and the male gaze often boil this kind of violence against women down once again to an individual act as opposed to looking at its like state structures. And so when you talk to sex workers who work in Thailand's red light districts, whether they're camming for international porn or whether they're doing in-person shows, what they're often asking for is not to be rescued from different kinds of sexualization. They're asking for better working conditions. They're asking for not just working conditions, but some level of accountability to account for the gross levels of rural-urban equality that exist in that country and that country versus the world. And so where these kinds of culpability come in, of course, are to be traced back to the very people who started these commercial sex industries in Southeast Asia. So it was specifically during the Vietnam Wars that American GIs are stationed in Thailand so that they can engage in rest and recreation. Then Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara actively encouraged the Thai state to shift its economy from one dependent on agriculture to one dependent on tourism, of which not only mass tourism, but commercial sex tourism certainly is like a core fabric of the economy there. And so it is that shift from agricultural work to in the rural areas to service sector work that has propelled all of the mass migration that we're seeing in Thailand and other countries in the Asia Pacific today. And so I think when I see questions that are specifically boiled down to like pornography or the hypersexualization of Asian women, which of course are important, and as Asian women we do deal with, navigate all the time, there's also the issue of the culpability of different structures and how people need to be attuned to like how it is that gross developmental inequalities shape these individual forms of hypersexualization as well. So I think whenever somebody in the audience, if you may be thinking about like the brutality of porn as you understand it, or the unimaginability that you or your daughter or somebody you love might do sex work, I think that people who are doing this work are asking you not to get stuck on that question, but to think largely about like the systems of recourse that people need to survive, that they are doing this work not by like a particular kind of force as we imagine it, but they're doing this work because it is the best kind of work that they often can do in a limited menu of range of opportunities. And so the same questions that we ask about the brutality of porn or of sex tourism, do we ask those in the same breath about domestic work, about work in the garment industry, about construction work, about low-wage service sector work across the board, because workers who are porn workers or Asian massage workers or sex workers, they are working all of these low-wage service sector jobs. And it is oftentimes only when they descend on the one that is closest to sex that the moral outrage around like, you know, connects with policing to really, really interfere with their lives.
Thank you. You really brought up a good point. Your point about who gets policed and what we focus on made me realize that a lot of times when we bring up fetishization, we're actually talking about imperialism. And so I don't know if Leanne wants to add more to that, but it just struck me that we kind of have these micro level focuses, and actually there's actually a macro level process that kind of captures all of that at the same time. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm being blinded by my own window, so I'm trying to change here. But I don't actually have much to add to what Elena laid out. I mean, I thought it was brilliant and beautiful and something that everyone should remember. I think that it is, I think maybe I'll just dovetail on one point she raised, which is around when the question of hypersexualization and fetishization gets applied, and to what kinds of questions that focus forecloses. And so for me, I'll just share one story. When I was doing work, one of the questions that was part of my ethnographic work, there was a story about an attorney was telling me about a client she had, and the client was trying to apply for a T visa. And the client was being interviewed at the time with FBI agents, and the attorney had recommended to her to talk about the different forms of violence she had undergone in her work as a sex worker, but in all the different areas of her life as well. She's trying to be eligible to apply. And her client is sort of downplaying the harm that she had gone through, and instead is being very sweet and not wanting to say too much. And so the attorney kind of pauses and says, you know, can I have a minute with my client? And the client says to her, you know, I feel like the more innocent and clean I can present myself, the more they'll want to help me. And it's pretty remarkable that somebody who had limited English access, knew nothing about the legal system within the United States, knew at least that much, right? And I think what I'm trying to say here is that there is this notion of kind of this quivering victim, and questions around consent and whether there was enough coercion, that I think are actually the forms of legal harm, right? That are actually state sanctioned forms of harm that we have to think about. When I first started my ethnographic work, an attorney said to me, you know, like everyone comes here, they're always looking for a quivering victim. Everyone wants to rescue someone and save someone. And I think that kind of goes back to the reification and the maintenance of a colonial logic and Western humanitarianism that Melissa, you raised earlier. So I just wanted to make that connection with your point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think what you just brought up for me makes me think about the ways that we have kind of accepted a certain perspective when we're having these conversations about sex work and sex trafficking. And we've kind of normalized, I would say, not even just the white gaze, but the white male evangelical gaze, and the ways those systems have been manifested from the start of our nation. And then not only that, but the ways that has connected to the contemporary moment. So a lot of what I'm hearing from you, I'm just thinking about the fact that a lot of what we're discussing is made possible by the fact that at one point in US history, it was perfectly legal to traffic women. It was perfectly legal to sexually exploit women and children. It was perfectly legal to profit off of the sexualization of people's bodies. And so even though we look at, say, the post-Civil War as this era that's supposed to have done away with that institution of enslavement, it's actually still appearing in the ways that we police. And I hear you also bring up the fact that the policing isn't done literally just by law enforcement, but also by churches, by NGOs, by community organizations who bring their perspective onto certain sites and places, and depending on who's occupying that space and place, have a certain type of perspective that they want to implement in this policing. And so I think that brings up two questions that people have brought up in the chat, is whether or not there's heteronormativity in relation to these things. I've just started recently reading a lot of critical heterosexuality work. So think about Adrienne Rich. I just read an essay by, oh my goodness, the name's slipping me, but like people like Monique Wittig, just like this 90s era formulation of what heteronormativity is, and the ways that we have kind of, as sociologists or as social scientists, when we talk about gender, we're not also talking about heterosexuality. And furthermore, when we're not talking about heterosexuality, we're also not talking about it as a system. And so what are the ways that you think that heteronormativity as a system are implicated in the types of policing that we're seeing? And even again, if you want to bring up this idea of abolishing, like maybe there's some type of abolishing of heterosexuality that needs to go on in order to address the ways that sex trafficking, sex work, care work, immigration have all become implicated in our contemporary moment in further marginalizing and exploiting women of color.
Thank you for breaking down that question for us, Melissa, and I really hope you bring in some of your own work as well. I love that question so much because I do believe the anti-trafficking movement is fundamentally heteronormative because of its preoccupation with sex that occurs outside of marriage. The same groups, same missionary groups that are going and trying to rescue quote unquote Asian sex slaves in Bangkok, for instance, will approach trans women, street-based workers, and have offered them $10, which was the local minimum wage at that time, 300 baht, to cut their hair. And many people on like different days where they were particularly like financially destitute would accept that. But it's I mean, like such a horrible, like read alongside rescue of sex work and then rescue from gender, or your sense of gender, is something that is like part and parcel in all of these. And I think that sex workers around the world have pointed out that so back to Empower in Thailand, they often say that we're the people who are keeping heterosexual marriages alive because we are satisfying people in ways that cannot be satisfied under the current like regimes and pressures of like late capitalism. And we're providing a specific kind of needed intimate labor that is actually keeping many marriages together. And I think there's so many other ways to speak to that and how it's coded in law, but eager to hear how each of you see it in your work.
Yeah, so to your point, I definitely see it in my work too. And what struck me was that I observed that many of the clients of the sex workers that had regulars in particular were married men. And the strip club's a little different because across the United States, I think Elena touched on this with licensing, there's different policies that you have depending on what state you're in. So for example, in New York, you can't get undressed, whereas Atlanta's notorious for the fact that you can get completely nude. They might have changed the rules recently, I'm not sure, but you can also touch people in certain places as opposed to other places. And then there's the architecture of the strip club in terms of the way that it's spaced depends on, one, how much it costs to be in that space and then what you can do there. So some spaces have a boom boom room, which is a VIP area where sex acts can get more explicit for a cost. But that said, it is observed that a lot of the labor that these women are doing are, I believe, perpetuating a type of heterosexuality that is not found in marriage, right? So it's alongside this rhetoric around marriage, particularly in Georgia, right, having so many organizations in Georgia invested in white Christian marriage, there's also this reality that sex work exposes is that sex within marriage, heterosexual marriage, is not tenable. And there's something that's going on there that bleeds over into these industries, right? And I think we need to also look at heterosexual marriage as an industry, and particularly the role of the wife and how she's disempowered in that, and the way a lot of what we talk about when we talk about sex workers can actually be said about wives. And every time I say that, it's an unpopular opinion, but the truth of the matter is, if we're going to bring heteronormativity into the discourse, we need to think about what we're saying about sex workers. Is this untrue for women, period? If I switch out the fact that she's a sex worker, if I switch out the fact that she's a wife, if I switch out her identity, who is she? And then furthermore, we're assuming a lot about the sexuality of sex workers because of who their clients are. So in my own research, I found that most of my dancers were actually bisexual or lesbian. And so I think there's this assumption of the sex worker intending to cater to male desire, when in actuality, it is just a form of labor. It is just a form of work. And so what we call sexuality, I think, is what we need to get at, right? We don't need to just talk about sexuality strictly in the course of intercourse, but also, how do I identify as a sexual person? How do people impose their sexuality onto me? The entire sexual commerce industry is the imposition of white male desires onto the landscape, onto the market, through various products meant to satisfy, that get racialized, gendered, and that creates the exploitation too. So I think it's a really great framework to look at heteronormativity when we're thinking about these things, because I think there's a lot of norms about sexuality that come up when we're talking about sex work, that we kind of miss when we give into the scapegoating of the sex worker and not the system itself. So, did you want to add anything more, Leah?
I think that, so I'll talk a bit about the law. And I think that when the proper, oh my gosh, my cat, the proper heteropatriarchal subject is also tied to the racialization of the proper patriarchal subject. And what I mean by that is that, you know, there's sort of two typical ways people sort of think about heteropatriarchy with the law. One is like the targets, communities that are targeted by policing laws, communities that are targeted by law enforcement outside of the logics of heteropatriarchy, be that through performance, through identity, through sexuality, through practices, through the space of the domestic and its relationship to the public. But there's also the writing, heteropatriarchal logic within the writing of law itself. And so if we think about VALA, or we think about the logic of modern American law, it actually operates on a gender neutral logic. And but that is already the ways in which it reinforces heteropatriarchy, right? That the law says that it operates through a race neutral as well as gender neutral logic in order to produce equality or sites of equality. But that logic in and of itself, as being blind to race and gender, is then what privileges and normalizes the heteropatriarchal figure. And so if we sort of take that and go a little bit deeper, I think that the successful figures that emerge through legal solutions, much of which many of, all of us have talked about on this call, have been successful through navigating those terms of racial and gendered purity, innocence, rescue, and saving, so forth. And so I think that that's kind of important to remember, is it's both communities that are targeted, but we also have to critique the very terms of the law's writing to begin with. So that's the only thing I would add.
Absolutely, thank you. So we have two questions that are somewhat related, but they're also on the longer side. So we have enough time, I think, for me to treat them separately. So given the history of violence toward women of color and the policing of racial capitalism and feminism, what can we as members of society do to support each other? What roles and actions can we take to ensure Asian women and every woman of color is seen and treated with dignity and respect?
We have to listen to each other. I mean, I think it's really, really, really important to take note of how often we hear like policy approaches or moral approaches to like certain kinds of feminism as like standing in for the voices of people who are most affected. And I'm sorry to bring it back to trafficking once more, but it is a great example to hear. If you read through maybe mainstream news reporting about what a raid on a massage business looks like, when it gets to the point where the massage worker themselves says they're not a victim of trafficking, I mean, this is them asserting their own experience and their voice. That is the point where all of these opinions descend on how that person is a victim of Stockholm syndrome. They're not aware of their own victimization. They're not aware, they must be coerced by a pimp or like some of these larger structures, all to distort this, to funnel them to being appropriate victims of sex trafficking. So in those accounts, when they're asking for broader kinds of labor protection, or where they need like some of the most mundane kinds of financial or technical assistance, we technically ignore those because they are not as interesting or as sensational as the narrative around sex. And I think it is so simple and it seems silly, but I think if we look around, even if we see like the kinds of reporting that are done in and around the massage killings, there's like a really desperate need to like fetishize the voice of a massage worker who will come forward and talk about the squalid conditions of massage work, but not somebody who wants to talk about the dignity in that and the dignity in like different kinds of eking out life as a low-wage migrant in this country. And so there's an entire desirability to how we hear which voices get to speak on behalf of others. And I just think that we all do absolutely need to like lean a little bit more into different ways of amplifying those voices that are already there. And of course, they are distorted by what kinds of, and Leanne's work demonstrates this beautifully, like what are they required to say legally to make them eligible for X, Y, and Z kinds of citizenship. But even beyond the legal, there's so many things that are just rooted in our own sense of, let's say, like what Western feminism has done, or what Western feminism says about sex work, or Western feminism says about the subordination of women that has been drastically like racist, colonial and imperialist. And I think that issue of voice is something that we really need to try to get behind and beyond.
I absolutely agree. And I think we should also lift up the work of Red Canary Song and the work that Elena is doing during this time. I think that there is a lot of attention and focus right now in terms of thinking about Asian migrant workers, Asian immigrant communities, Asian refugees, Asian American communities. But I think it's really important to consistently raise up and lift up the work of feminist organizations, sex worker rights organizations, and anti-violence organizations that have been grappling with really difficult questions for a very long time. So I think the work of Survived and Survived and Punished, Inside Creative Interventions, as we talked about earlier, I think that now during this time, I think looking at the analysis of feminist of color organizations within anti-violence movements and feminist abolitionist work is very important. And again, just really difficult to do, but I think is what we need during this moment. And I think that that's all I really want to do is just amplify that work more and more while there's an opportunity to do so.
And also, the question was so interesting because it also was asking specifically about the linked policing of racial capitalism and feminism. And so I think a responsibility, I mean, I think in this moment there are Asian women coming together in really unprecedented ways. But for Red Canary, I think two grassroots campaigns and organizations that we rely so heavily on are the Flushing Worker Center, who I guarantee you is not getting, any nearly as much attention as they need to in this moment. So there's like huge spotlight on like police and Asian massage work. It's connected to sex. But we use the Flushing Worker Center space as the place where we conduct outreach. It is their connection and like infrastructure in Flushing itself that enables us to be able to do that work. And so to be able to like sit from a place of, okay, maybe transnational feminist organizing and reach into these other important coalitions. Another is, as I previously mentioned, FADA, Flushing Anti-Displacement Alliance. Their work against gentrification is also really, really important. And so if we take that, as this anonymous attendee has asked, intersections of racial capitalism and feminism, it requires us to go beyond feminism into gentrification. It requires us to move into labor, migrant rights, to the broad issue of deportation, which we haven't even touched upon yet. But I was thinking as a possible answer to this next question that we have from Wendy, I wonder how economic class privilege plays a role such that the Asian community may actually be challenged within itself to support a class privilege that is different than their own, or perhaps not to use shame as a weapon against other Asians. What is an approach that can be used to challenge this narrative? I think it's so important to point out the diversity and also the different kinds of classism, racism, nativism that exist within Asian America, certainly. I want to uplift the work of incredible Southeast Asian organizer activists through Southeast Asian Freedom Network, CIRAC, who are working on incredible anti-deportation campaigns. They have really, really pointed out that just 2 days before the brutal murder of March 16th, the plane of 33 Vietnamese Americans were deported back to Vietnam, and that level of state-sanctioned violence against Asians cannot be divorced from the individual attacks that we saw on the 16th. And so there's incredible work being done by organizations that are pushing back against the kinds of deportation that affect all of our communities, but most grossly right now, Southeast Asian Americans, refugees.
Thank you. I think if I were to respond to what you two were saying about that first piece, as far as, I guess, unity seems so vague of a term, but the idea of the ways that we can reach across what are, I guess, socially constructed boundaries that put us into space in the first place. So one of the things that Elena brought up made me think about gentrification and the ways that when we talk about anti-Asian violence or even anti-Black violence, we often focus on bodies, but not necessarily the ways that the same laws and policies policing bodies police space, and then why that policing of space clears the path for gentrification. So one of the things that I did prior to preparing for this talk was I looked at the locations of where these spas were, because in my own research, one of the things that I found was that spas or the strip clubs were located exclusively in these industrial zones. And then this history of these industrial zones was such that during the post-Civil War era when Black people were starting to form their own communities in Georgia, this zoning was created as to keep space between people, but that zoning also mapped onto the labor of Black workers. So Black men, being the industrial workers, were relegated to being in the industrial zone and living in residential areas that were proximate to where they worked, while white suburban Atlantans formed these white-owned communities, so like North Druid Hills that I mentioned earlier. And these are the spaces that from post-Civil War to present day where the racial outlines of the state of Georgia. The part for Black people and white people, there has not been much shift patterns. And so I briefly saw that in the history of Chinese labor in Georgia, it's the same thing, like the cities where Chinese migrants came to do labor in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they are the same exact communities to this present day. And then when we look at the space of the spas, they once again are in these industrial zones, kind of relegated away from the gaze of the same white Christians who have taken up space in these sex trafficking organizations and such to police these areas that they're not physically at. And so then when gentrification comes, it comes on the heels of the racial logics that were established in the post-Civil War, right? So it's mighty easy to gentrify a space that's mostly just factories and things to that effect. And then furthermore, I feel like it conceals violence, right? Like displacing where these women do their labor, whether it's a strip club or a massage parlor, displacing it away from the gaze of the majority of residents makes it that much easier for the media or whoever to kind of create these narratives and discourse around policing these spaces. And so it all gets reinforced once again. So I really appreciate you both bringing up those points. And so I guess with our final question, or actually it's not a question, but just appreciation. And I should mention that if you haven't gotten a chance, people are really appreciating the insights that you're bringing forward. So I think if there's anything that we haven't really touched on that either one of you kind of wanted to bring up again and just expand on a little bit, I think now's the time since we don't have questions right now.
There was we had answered a part 2 to a question and not so much a part 1, and it's a difficult question, and I don't have the answer, and I wish that we had traditional in-person format so that different people in the audience can pipe up. But Marissa Fang had said, I'm a retired language teacher in public schools on Long Island. Many of my colleagues are concerned about how to address Stop Asian Hate properly to students in the classroom where 80-90% of the student body are Caucasian. And I'm so aware that some of the things that we're talking about, particularly like if you're trying to talk about sex work and sexual labor, these are very, very difficult topics to talk about with young people. But I think that so much of, I'm incredibly inspired. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, where high school students are actually suing the state for lack of adequate ethnic studies built into civics education. And it's been really, really, really inspiring watching their fight because it's so true. I mean, they'll point out things that are missing from the curriculum that I, as a professor with a PhD, felt like, oh, I also never learned about that in all the like 25 years of my education. So I think that whereas these lessons I think that we're sharing may seem difficult to maybe impart onto students, they are part of a broader like justice-oriented framework that's oriented around like amplifying erasure, and that across all different kinds of curriculum, you can find different ways to speak to different histories that are just not pointed out in curricula. And so one amazing opportunity for them might be to reconstruct as a class their own, history curriculum, civics curriculum, to look at how these histories of violence and policing may have been erased. I think that we have seen in the past, 5 years, 10 years, how it is definitely a privilege for certain youth to not have to talk about certain kinds of problems, for certain youth to not even have to speak about race when others are brutally policed on a daily basis and have like internalized that into the fabric of everything they know. And so I don't think that we need to shy away from these difficult conversations, but use it as a way to like teach them that they have the agency to spotlight things that are missing. And I say that feeling like there's so many things that I don't know that I think it must be so hard to be a young person today.
Yes, it is very hard to be a person today. But I absolutely, that was brilliant. And, I think what Elena is saying is, there's just so much, it's a long road, but it's a road. I think her point is that this is a road that we need to embark on now. I absolutely agree that having difficult conversations is actually what we do need to talk about. I think it's very hard to even identify what is the difficult conversation. And I think that kind of goes back to the point that both Elena and Melissa have raised, which is having conversations across communities, but also the difficult conversations within our own communities, the way we see ourselves and the communities we are and are not a part of. I often sort of ask many of my students, when we sort of think about the relationship of Asian Americans within a white world, the sort of exclusion point of access is always around citizenship. But what does that mean when citizenship to the US nation state is already lodged within the history of colonialism itself? That to become the citizen and the marking of the citizen also has within it a language around colonialism and anti-Blackness. So what would it mean if we thought about Asian American politics not within a white world and its antagonism to a white world, but what if we thought about the possibilities of Asian American politics and Asian American feminist politics within the logic of anti-Blackness? How would that actually shift and open up different kinds of ways that we can build material relations with others, but also a different way of thinking about ourselves? And I don't have an immediate answer, but it's the type of struggle I think I'm willing to go down with folks that are on this call and the audience that is here today. So.
Thank you for that, Ann and Elena. And I want to add to that question too, that I think that when we think about those questions and how we can have that conversation, not just about Asian people or Black people disparately, but trying to surface the ways that the history of being a person of color in this society is interrelated, right? So I think one of the ways that we can get at that for people is talking about the history of labor, and the history of labor, particularly in the US South, and the ways that the labor and immigration of a lot of Asians to the United States was predicated on, one, the end of slavery, and then two, the refusal or the protests of a lot of Black people post-slavery to work for low wages. And so the way that the immigration system in this country was created to exploit both the Black people and Asian people simultaneously. And then the ways that that then affects other people of color, whether they be immigrants from Africa or Latin America or other places on the planet. So I think trying to surface for your students that these things are interrelated, but not necessarily separate, is very important, particularly given the way media discourse kind of stokes this idea that there's divisions between Black people and Asian Americans in the United States.
Yes, and thank you so much for that really beautiful history of intertwined legacies of slavery. I think it is completely absent. Just to take one more detour, trafficking has become synonymous somehow with the phrase modern day slavery, which, if you read the brilliant work of Lindsay Buchan, has completely capitalized off of anti-Blackness. Lindsay has a book coming out calling trafficking anti-Blackness, because there's a seeming complete erasure in the anti-trafficking movement, in as much as it has fetishized like the Asian sex slave as ideal victim, of the types of hyper-policing on Black bodies that it has completely endorsed. And so that's one other thing that I would love audience members to think through, or to question, or to pause when you hear this term modern day slavery. What is it doing? It is seemingly profiting off of the histories of guilt of the transatlantic slave trade for Americans by swapping out the enslaved African with a whole slew of, low-wage workers in more ideal racialized gendered subjects, and calling for their rescue. So Melissa, I really, really, really think what you said is really important history that we're not reckoning with.
Thank you. And I think what you brought up to me too was this idea of like the ways this has shifted over history. And I think I'll be turning it over to Adrian after this statement, but basically the ways that when we think about how we kind of erase the legacy of slavery in our conversations about contemporary violence and systems, we also don't necessarily understand how we got there. And once again, this is idea of about the ways that in a system that began with the colonial enslavement of African people as well as indigenous genocide, when it came to the end of slavery and having to deal with a population that could no longer be exploited for free, this is when this discourse and rhetoric changes. So in the early 20th century comes the White Slave Trafficking Act, and this is an anti-Black act. It's also called the Mann Act, that still gets used today. That was actually formed in response to interracial relationships between Black men and white men, and white women rather, and policing the ability of Black men to be in these intimate relationships and partnerships. So even then we might look at, say, federal rulings about interracial relationships, such as Loving versus Virginia, I believe that's the correct one, as the end of this discrimination. But like I said, the Mann Act still exists, and furthermore, in practice, it still disproportionately affects Black men, while trafficking, as we claim, or that we're centered on, especially if we're centering Asian women, it's like, who is implicated in the trafficking of these women? And it's not the person who's most likely to be penalized for that trafficking. And so that too kind of reinforces the way that xenophobia and anti-Blackness function together to keep these systems of exploitation going. So yeah, thank you for that comment as well. I believe that's all the time we have for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and let Adrian wrap us up today.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Leanne, and thank you, Elena, for really an amazing hour and a half. I took so many notes. I was going to highlight a few points, but it's 5 pages, and we need another hour and a half to go over it. I think this idea of amplifying these erasures that sort of structure the way we narrate, when we talk about immigration, when we talk about legal frameworks, the way we talk about labor, and the way we talk about intimacy, I think that you all sort of landed on at the end seems to me absolutely central, how they kind of structure the racial landscape in which policing operates today. So I thought that this was absolutely phenomenal, and thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I thought that the questions were great, so thank you to the audience for being here. I expected to hear brilliant analysis today, and it was absolutely brilliant. I didn't expect quite this much hope, and I want to thank you for that too. I thought that several times there were really, the clouds parted, and it sounded like, hey, this is hard, but it can be done, and there's really, and as long as we don't fall for these easy narratives, we're in much better shape to actually create justice and equity around how we organize urban space, how we organize citizenship, how we think about labor, how we think about social justice. So thank you for that as well. I think that's needed too in a moment like this. And finally, I wanted to point out that one of our questions that's still open is from Jennifer Ho, who asked about who thanks you for this incredibly nuanced and in-depth examination, which I fully agree with, and asked whether we would be able to provide a list of organizations mentioned during the talk. I'll just say, yes, we will compile that and we will send that out to everyone here, because there were so many organizations highlighted here today that deserve to be uplifted, that deserve to be supported, and that some of the undergraduates or non-undergraduates in attendance might want to work with going forward. So thank you for highlighting those organizations as well. And thank you all for being here. Thank you three for an amazing conversation. And I really cannot thank you enough.